Hello everyone, welcome to Nightmare Echo. I know most of you use this video to sleep, so relax and drift off as we begin. It was supposed to be just another Sunday afternoon. Families walked their dogs. Children played near the edge of quiet cul-de-sacs. And in the wealthier part of town, a large brick estate sat tucked behind overgrown hedges and rusted iron gates. The locals rarely saw the man who lived there. He didn't like visitors. And even the mailman said he never came to the door. But inside that home, there were things no one should ever have to see. Things no one could ever unsee. Hundreds of fragments buried beneath the soil, scattered across the backyard, forgotten like discarded trash. But they weren't trash. They were human remains. In another town, thousands of miles away, a young girl waved goodbye to her friends after school. She never made it home. Days passed. Then weeks. Police knocked on doors. Flyers fluttered from telephone poles. Cameras flashed, reporters asked questions, and her parents waited by the window, hoping she'd return. But she hadn't vanished. She hadn't run away. She had been hidden, intentionally. For years. By someone who had once told her he would keep her safe. And then, there was the man who dressed sharply, dined at the finest restaurants, and smiled like he had nothing to hide. His victims trusted him. They followed him. They never left. There were no bodies left to find. Just sludge. Acid. And an empty garage that reeked of chemicals no one could explain, until it was too late. These aren't the stories you hear on the evening news. They aren't bedtime tales told around a campfire. These are the truths hidden beneath years of silence, deception, and horror. Tonight, we walk through each one. We follow the clues. We revisit the evidence. And we ask the questions no one wants to hear right before falling asleep. This is 7 Most Disturbing True Crime Stories for Sleep, with rain sounds. Relax as we begin. Story 1. It was the mid-1990s in Indiana. The kind of suburb where families mowed their lawns on Sundays, where kids rode their bikes past well-trimmed hedges, and where secrets, if they existed, were kept tightly shut behind garage doors and closed curtains. At the edge of this quiet world stood Fox Hollow Farm. A vast estate tucked deep into the woods, far from the streetlights and neighbors' glances. A mansion with a private indoor pool, manicured grounds, and rooms that echoed with silence. The man who owned it, Herb Baumeister, was a successful business owner. He co-founded a chain of thrift stores that made him wealthy, comfortably so. He wore suits to work, coached his son's baseball games, and hosted barbecues with plastic cups and charcoal burgers on summer afternoons. To those who met him briefly, Herb seemed eccentric. A little odd. He spoke too quickly, laughed at the wrong times, and had a strange way of avoiding eye contact mid-conversation. But in a world where outward success often masks internal unrest, no one thought much of it. He had money. A wife. Children. A business. And a house most people could only dream of owning. But Herb also had another life. One that unfolded only after the sun went down. One that played out in bars across downtown Indianapolis, specifically in the city's gay nightlife scene. He used a fake name. Said he was single. Drove into the city alone. And by morning, he was back at the breakfast table, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. At the time, young men were vanishing from the area. Mostly from the same stretch of nightclubs and bars. Some were last seen getting into cars. Others just seemed to disappear into thin air. There was no formal pattern that police could prove. Just quiet rumors. Fear. And a growing list of missing names. Then, a break came. One man, who narrowly escaped after a chilling night at Herb's home, came forward. His story was hard to believe, until investigators showed up at Fox Hollow Farm with a search warrant. The property was vast, with acres of land, dense with trees and overgrown brush. But it was near the edge of the yard where they found something odd. At first glance, it looked like gravel or crushed rock. But it wasn't. They bent down, looked closer, and realized what they were seeing wasn't stone. It was fragments. Thousands of them. Shattered. Burned. Scattered. Pieces of human bone, buried beneath leaves and dust. But something didn't make sense. Investigators found bones. But the skulls were missing. The discovery wasn't made by detectives or cadaver dogs. It was made by a child. Herb Baumeister's son had been playing in the woods behind the house when he stumbled on something strange in the dirt, something pale, jagged, and half-buried. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It didn't look like a rock. It looked like part of a bone. When he showed it to his mother, she froze. That small fragment, innocent in a child's palm, was the beginning of everything unraveling. Julie Baumeister had long lived with questions she didn't know how to ask. Herb had become distant. He'd started sleeping in a separate room. His moods were unpredictable. His absences more frequent. She told friends he was stressed, overworked, just tired. But now, staring at the object her son had found in their own backyard, those excuses no longer made sense. She called the authorities. She handed over everything she could. Photographs. Clothing. Stories. The truth started to seep through the cracks. The police returned with forensics teams. Over days, then weeks, they combed the property. What they uncovered shocked even seasoned investigators. Scattered across the grounds were the remains of at least 11 individuals, men who had vanished without explanation, their disappearances never fully investigated because of who they were and where they were last seen. But this wasn't just about one man hiding his secrets. This was a failure that stretched further. A failure of patterns missed. Of warnings ignored. Of lives overlooked because they didn't fit the profile of who society expects to be mourned. The Baumeisters had lived for years in that house. They'd celebrated birthdays. Hosted family dinners. Hung ornaments on Christmas trees. All while a horror was buried just feet from where they slept. When Herb realized the investigation was closing in, he fled. He drove north, crossed into Canada, and left a note behind. Days later, he was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, lying near a riverbank beneath the trees. Alone. And silent. Just like the victims he left behind. His family never got the answers. Only the memories, and the knowledge that the man they loved was someone they never truly understood. They thought they knew him. A husband. A father. A businessman. But no one really knew the monster living inside Fox Hollow Farm. What if the next killer didn't bury the bodies, but dissolved them? Story 2. Police were baffled. There were no fingerprints. No blood. No clothing. No bones. Just a greasy black liquid seeping through the floor of a small storeroom. Beside it sat several drums, uncapped, emitting a sharp, metallic stench that clung to the walls. The windows were sealed. The air, heavy. The man who rented the space said it was for experiments. But the landlord had begun to worry. Something didn't feel right. When authorities arrived, they found what looked like a workshop. A few tools. Some glassware. But nothing that would explain the missing people connected to the man who'd signed the lease, John George Hay. He was mild-mannered. Always well-dressed. Polite, articulate, and seemingly harmless. But there was a detail that stood out to investigators. One of the missing individuals had last been seen walking into this very building. They were never seen again. The only trace left behind was in the residue collected from the floor. When tested, it revealed something shocking: dissolved fat. Human fat. And traces of bone. It was 1949 in London, just a few years after the war. The city was rebuilding, resources were limited, and people were trusting, especially of someone like Hay, who spoke like a gentleman and dressed like a banker. His victims never suspected a thing. But Hay had spent time in prison before. Forgery, theft, fraud. He'd studied court cases. Obsessed over legal loopholes. And came to a conclusion that would shape his crimes. If there was no body, he believed, there could be no murder charge. So he set out to perfect a method, one that would erase the very existence of a victim. His first was a wealthy acquaintance, William McSwan. Hay lured him to a basement under the promise of discussing business. Once there, he struck him from behind and placed the body in a large steel drum. He poured in concentrated sulfuric acid and left it overnight. The next morning, all that remained was sludge and fragments, easily dumped down a manhole. He repeated this process again and again, growing more confident with each disappearance. He targeted couples, elderly individuals, people with assets he could forge into his own name. He forged documents, posed as a trusted confidant, and emptied their bank accounts. By the time anyone noticed they were missing, Hay had already cashed in their estates and erased all physical evidence of their fate. He didn't see it as killing. He saw it as removing obstacles. Hay's charm was his disguise. He spoke softly, avoided confrontation, and appeared helpful to anyone who met him. He dressed in fine coats, wore gloves, and always kept his shoes polished. No one suspected that this clean-cut man was carefully constructing a system of murder that left no corpse, no mess, nothing for the courts to hold against him. But it wasn't just about theft. There was something else. Something far more disturbing behind the method he chose. When asked by police why he used acid, Hay replied with a calm expression. It was cleaner. Each new victim was a test. A trial. A slow escalation of his confidence and control. He perfected the setup. First, he'd identify someone with assets. Then, earn their trust. Take them out for dinner. Laugh with them. Sometimes, even dine in their homes. Then, he'd invite them to the basement or workshop, telling them he had something exciting to show. A new project. A business venture. Something lucrative. They'd follow. And once they stepped inside, floating near the bottom were small, jagged shards, bone fragments, part of a denture, and a single, corroded gallstone. It wasn't much. But it was enough. Enough to prove that Olive Duran Deacon hadn't simply disappeared. Enough to dismantle the fantasy John Hay had so carefully constructed around himself. Enough to show that murder doesn't require a corpse to be real. The gallstone was particularly damning, something the acid couldn't break down. It remained intact, almost like it had refused to be forgotten. Investigators sent it for testing. The results came back clear. Human. Female. And consistent with the dental records and medical history of the missing widow. John Hay was arrested the same day. At first, he kept up the act. Calm. Collected. Cordial. He asked for tea. Spoke to detectives as if they were old friends discussing something hypothetical. But eventually, when confronted with the evidence, he gave in. His confession wasn't what anyone expected. He didn't just admit to the murder of Olive. He volunteered details about others. Names that hadn't even been connected to him yet. William McSwan. The Hendersons. The same people he had once impersonated in letters and legal documents. He described the killings in cold, methodical terms. No remorse. No hesitation. He explained how long it took the acid to work. How he disposed of the remains. How he cleaned the floor afterward. It was as though he believed sharing the process made him clever. He wasn't a man weighed down by guilt. He was fascinated by the details. And yet, for all his planning, for all his attempts to stay one step ahead of the law, he made a fatal mistake, he underestimated what the body leaves behind. In court, the prosecution didn't need a full skeleton. They had enough evidence to paint a picture far more terrifying, a man who saw others not as people, but as problems to be erased. The jury took just minutes to reach a verdict. Hay was sentenced to death. He spent his final days at Wandsworth Prison. Still polished. Still polite. He requested a suit for his execution. Dark blue. Pressed. As if appearances might still matter. On August 10, 1949, he was hanged. The acid didn't protect him. The charm didn't save him. His own logic, no body, no crime, had been shattered by the very science he thought would shield him. He believed he could outsmart justice. But justice found a way to outlast him. What happens when the prison is not made of walls or bars, but a basement? A father? A locked door? Story 3. For 24 years, she was missing. Except she was never gone. She was right beneath their feet. The world above moved on, birthdays passed, winters melted into springs, newspapers changed headlines, and the voices in the kitchen laughed and argued like any other family. But below it, beneath a modest home in Emstetten, Austria, behind a heavy steel door and layers of concrete, a young woman lived in silence. Elizabeth Fritzl's last day of freedom came when she was just 18. Her father asked her to help him carry something into the newly finished basement. She followed him down the narrow stairs, unaware that each step she took was leading her further away from the outside world than she could possibly imagine. When she turned to leave, the door was already locked. She screamed at first. Pounded on the walls. Begged to be let out. But the concrete swallowed her voice. Her world shrank to a few square meters, no windows, no sunlight, no clocks to track the hours. Just cold cement and the unrelenting hum of pipes overhead. Her father, Joseph Fritzl, told everyone she had run away. That she joined a cult. That she wanted nothing to do with the family. And in the beginning, they believed him. Years passed. And still, no one questioned where Elizabeth had gone. But she hadn't gone anywhere. Inside that hidden cellar, behind a reinforced door with an electric code only Joseph knew, Elizabeth was kept as a prisoner. He brought her food. Controlled the lights. The air. Her every movement. Time changed her body. Changed her voice. But no one heard it. No one saw it. She gave birth to 7 children. In that same space. Without doctors. Without medication. Sometimes in the dark. She bit down on towels to muffle the pain. Used scissors her father handed her through a slot in the door. Cleaned the blood with rags and plastic bags. 3 of the children stayed with her in the basement. The other 3, raised upstairs by Joseph and his wife, were said to have been found on the doorstep. With handwritten letters supposedly from Elizabeth, asking her parents to take care of the babies. No one questioned how he always seemed to find them. No one thought to ask why the letters looked the same. Or why Elizabeth, after all these years, had never called. The space she lived in was small, low ceilings, damp air. Pipes ran along the walls, leaking occasionally. Mold crept into the corners. The children knew no sky, no trees, no sound of cars passing by. Their world was a hallway. A single room. Sometimes, if Joseph allowed it, a television with old cartoons. Elizabeth taught them to read using torn pages from books he brought. She whispered bedtime stories by flashlight. Drew clocks on the wall to teach them how to tell time. All while knowing that every day they remained there, the world outside was forgetting she had ever existed. She tried to escape once, early on. He punished her for weeks. After that, she stopped trying. But she never stopped hoping. Never stopped waiting for the day when someone might hear something. Ask the right question. Open the wrong door. That day didn't come for 24 years. And when it did, when a child born in that basement grew ill and was taken to a hospital, it was the first time in decades that the truth had a chance to surface. Doctors were alarmed. The child had never seen sunlight. Her bones told a story her mother couldn't. And when they asked Joseph questions, his answers unraveled. Police began searching the house. Looking closely. Listening carefully. And then, in a hallway that looked like any other, they noticed something strange. A door. Heavy. Reinforced. Sealed from the inside. Behind it, the air was thick with the scent of dampness and decay. The door, once so carefully hidden, now stood as the threshold to a nightmare that had remained out of sight for far too long. When the police pried it open, the first thing they noticed was the suffocating silence. It was a world that had been frozen in time, a world of concrete walls, flickering lights, and a strange, eerie stillness. Elizabeth Fritzl, thin and gaunt, emerged from the shadows, her face a portrait of pain, exhaustion, and disbelief. She had lived there for so long that the sunlight, which flooded into the room, almost blinded her. She hadn't seen it in years. The police were stunned. Not just by her condition, but by the small children who clung to her side. The youngest was just a toddler, his eyes wide and uncertain. They had never seen the world outside that basement. They had only known darkness, the cold hum of electricity, and the occasional voice of their grandfather, who they called Papa. Elizabeth, despite her fear, managed to tell them her story in fragments. She spoke of the years of captivity, of the manipulation, the control, and the pain. She spoke of the horrifying truth that her father had not only locked her away, but had fathered several of her children. As the details of her captivity slowly emerged, it became clear just how meticulous Joseph Fritzl had been in keeping his dark secret. He had fabricated a life for his family, a life that didn't include Elizabeth. He had constructed a false narrative that kept everyone at bay, all the while imprisoning his daughter and using her to fulfill his twisted desires. Elizabeth's mother, who had lived upstairs for all those years, had no idea her daughter was trapped beneath her. She was told Elizabeth had run away. But when the truth was finally uncovered, it shattered everything she had believed. Her husband's lies had been so convincing, so thorough, that it was impossible to comprehend the scale of his deception. The world outside finally knew what had happened behind those concrete walls. It was a story that would haunt everyone who heard it, and for Elizabeth, it was a long road ahead. She had lost nearly a quarter of a century of her life, locked away from everything, from everyone. The emotional scars would take much longer to heal. But the physical ones, the ones left by the years of abuse, the birth of children she had no choice but to care for, were even deeper. And yet, Elizabeth survived. Against all odds, she endured. The family she once had, the life she had once known, was no more. But the woman who emerged from that basement was not the same girl who had entered it. She had been shaped by years of torment, but she had also been shaped by a will to survive. The court proceedings that followed were a painful reminder of the cruelty of the world, but also of the resilience of the human spirit. Joseph Fritzl was convicted of multiple charges, including incest, imprisonment, and the abuse of his daughter and grandchildren. He was sentenced to life in prison. For Elizabeth, the battle wasn't just with the man who had held her captive, it was with a world that had allowed it to happen. How could no one have known? How could her suffering have gone unnoticed for so long? These questions would linger for years to come. And while justice was served in the courtrooms, the damage done to Elizabeth Fritzl and her children would never be fully repaired. But for the first time in decades, they had a chance at freedom. A chance to rebuild their lives, away from the shadows of the basement, away from the man who had stolen everything from them. While Elizabeth Fritzl's life in the basement was marked by darkness and silence, the world above her moved on as if nothing had changed. Her father, Joseph, ate dinner with the family, sat at the table with his wife, and shared moments that seemed so ordinary. But in the silence of the basement, Elizabeth's world was a stark contrast. Beneath their feet, she was locked away, trapped in a concrete hell. No one in the house had any idea what was happening just one floor below. To them, Elizabeth had vanished without a trace. It was a family's worst nightmare, except no one knew it. Her father, the very man who had stolen her life, played his part in the illusion with disturbing ease. He ate his meals, gave his reports, and maintained the facade of the family man. As if nothing was wrong. As if the screams from below had never happened. As if the woman locked away like a forgotten ghost in his basement wasn't his own daughter. The world saw him as a successful father. They had no reason to question the stability of their home. Elizabeth's mother believed in her husband's lies. The neighbors saw a model family. But deep down, in the shadows, the truth waited. And when that truth finally emerged, when the concrete walls were shattered and Elizabeth stepped into the light after 24 years, it wasn't just the police who had questions. The world had questions. How could someone survive that? How do you begin again after 24 years of torment? How could a father, a man who sat at the dinner table, have been capable of such horror? How could he have lived a life of duality, playing the part of a loving husband and father while committing the most unspeakable crimes in his own home? For Elizabeth, escape wasn't just about walking out of the basement. It was about survival. It was about holding on to something, anything, that could allow her to move forward. The years of captivity, the years of abuse, could have crushed her spirit. But they didn't. Elizabeth's escape wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It wasn't just the locked door that kept her trapped, it was the mental manipulation, the conditioning, the endless abuse. The trauma of being forced to carry her father's children. The isolation. The suffocating loneliness. The fear. But in that moment, when the door finally opened, she could finally breathe again. Her escape was more than just a rescue. It was a reawakening, a confrontation with the world she had been forced to ignore for so long. It was as if she had been asleep for decades, and now, she had to learn to live again. And while justice was eventually served, Joseph Fritzl was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Elizabeth's journey didn't end in the courtroom. The scars, the emotional wreckage, the lifelong trauma, those were things no court could fix. They were things no amount of justice could erase. Elizabeth's story became a testament to human resilience. To the capacity of the mind and spirit to endure. But it was also a reminder of the deepest human vulnerability. How does someone survive that? How do you begin again after losing everything, your youth, your family, your freedom, your sense of self? There's no easy answer. There are no simple resolutions. The journey of healing for Elizabeth was, and still is, ongoing. The emotional scars may never fully fade. But the strength she found to survive, to escape, to live, is something that no prison could ever contain. The family she once knew was forever changed. She would never be able to look at the world the same way again. And though justice had been served in the eyes of the law, the true cost of her captivity would be something only she could understand. As Elizabeth walked away from the ruins of her past, she faced the hardest challenge of all, not surviving, but living. Truly living. Story 4. He said she died before 9 a.m. But her Fitbit told a different story. At 9:20, the device recorded her last moments of movement. The data was there, in black and white, and it would prove to be the key to unraveling a story that was anything but straightforward. Connie DeBate's life had seemed to follow the traditional American dream, married with children, a home of their own, and all the trappings of a successful family. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form in the marriage of Connie and Richard DeBate. Richard, a man who projected an image of the happy husband, had begun to take on a much darker role in the weeks leading up to her death. He had been having an affair, a secret that, once revealed, would shake everything about the life they had built together. The timeline Richard had painted for authorities seemed to fall into place. He told investigators that he was away at the gym that morning when, back at home, an intruder broke into their house. He claimed that Connie had been brutally attacked by this mysterious assailant, who had then fled the scene. The details seemed convincing, but something didn't sit right. Richard's account started to unravel when investigators turned to the smart technology that had been integrated into their lives, technology that would not only confirm his lies but also paint a far more complex picture of the morning's events. The Fitbit data didn't lie. At 9:20 a.m., Connie's wristband showed she had been walking around, moving, perhaps trying to escape, long after Richard claimed she was already dead. It was this revelation that marked the beginning of a shift in the investigation. What seemed like a tragic case of a home invasion was now beginning to look like something more calculated. With this new information, investigators began to examine every corner of Richard's life, peeling back the layers to reveal a man with more to hide than anyone could have imagined. Financial troubles began to surface, debts mounting, and the realization that Connie's life insurance policy would benefit Richard to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Was this a carefully executed plan, an attempt to get rid of a wife in financial distress and take the money for himself? But as they dug deeper into Richard's life, more twists began to emerge. His story didn't add up. Richard had been in contact with Connie at 9 a.m., a detail that contradicted his own timeline. He had said he was far from home when the crime occurred, but the tech evidence, his phone, his wife's Fitbit, and other pieces, told a different story. The lies he'd told seemed to collapse like a house of cards. The investigators began to ask themselves, if Richard didn't kill Connie, then who did? Was there someone else involved, a third party who had been able to manipulate the evidence or had another motive entirely? Or had Richard, in fact, concocted the story from the very beginning? Every theory seemed plausible, but each was more chilling than the last. As the case progressed, the financial problems began to take center stage. Richard's motivations were becoming clearer, and yet, the more they uncovered, the more complex the story became. How could someone so close to the victim, someone who had been married to her for years, turn on them so ruthlessly? What had driven him to this extreme? Was it greed, desperation, or something darker still? And was the affair just the tip of the iceberg? The unraveling of Richard DeBate's life led to startling discoveries about his psyche. The investigators not only had to contend with a murderer who thought he could outsmart the system, but with a man whose lies were so deeply woven into the fabric of his life, they couldn't see the truth until it was too late. As the trial came to a close, the questions remained. Did Richard kill Connie in a moment of rage, or had he planned it all along, his every move calculated for maximum gain? Was his affair just a symptom of a deeper dissatisfaction, or had it been the catalyst that set this tragedy into motion? When the truth finally came out, it left more questions than answers. Richard had believed that his lies, his manipulation of technology and time, would be enough to cover his tracks. But in the end, the very technology he had relied on to build his alibi became the thing that destroyed him. His wife's Fitbit, a simple device meant to track fitness, became the one thing that brought down a murderer. And for those who followed the case, it served as a chilling reminder that sometimes, the smallest details, like a few minutes of movement recorded on a wristband, are enough to expose even the most carefully constructed lies. Richard DeBate's fate was sealed by the truth he could no longer escape. The investigation, the evidence, and the technology all came together in a way that even he couldn't deny. And for the family, for the community, and for those who had followed the case, it was a sobering reminder of the power of technology and the lengths people would go to in order to hide the darkest of secrets. "I wanted to believe him," her sister said, her voice trembling as she recalled the moments after Connie's death. But the data doesn't lie. It was a line that would echo throughout the trial, a haunting reflection of the trust that had been broken. Connie's sister had wanted to trust her brother-in-law, to believe his story, to mourn with him in the way families should. But the evidence, the cold, impersonal data from a small device strapped to Connie's wrist, shattered everything. That Fitbit, once a symbol of health and wellness, had now become the silent witness to a crime that would change the course of their lives forever. Richard had tried to spin his tale, to paint a picture of a random tragedy, a home invasion gone wrong. But as investigators combed through the evidence, piece by piece, it became increasingly clear that his story wasn't adding up. The timeline he had constructed, the phone calls, the supposed events of that fateful morning, all unraveled under the scrutiny of technology. The Fitbit data, showing Connie's movements long after Richard claimed she had already died, became the nail in his coffin. And as much as Richard tried to deny it, as much as he clung to his version of events, the technology did not lie. But the case didn't end with just the Fitbit. It was only the beginning of a long, drawn-out investigation into the twists and turns of the Debate household. The more they uncovered about Richard, the affair, the financial strain, the mounting debt, the more it became clear that he had a motive far darker than he had ever let on. Each revelation, each new detail, seemed to only deepen the mystery of why Connie had to die. The family struggled with the truth. How could someone they had loved and trusted, someone who had been a part of their lives for so many years, be capable of such betrayal? They wanted to believe in his innocence, wanted to hold on to the person they thought they knew. But the data, the irrefutable evidence, was there in black and white, and no amount of denial could erase it. It wasn't just the data that destroyed Richard's defense, it was the emotional weight of the situation, the sheer magnitude of the loss that his family and Connie's loved ones had to bear. They had been victims, too, victims of a lie that had been carefully crafted over months and years. And as the trial continued, their heartbreak only deepened. They realized that their pain wasn't just from losing Connie, it was also from losing the man they thought they knew, the man who had so easily deceived them all. In the courtroom, Richard's attempts to explain away the evidence seemed more desperate with each passing day. He claimed that he had been a victim too, a man caught in a tragic series of events beyond his control. But as the prosecution laid out the facts, piece by piece, it became increasingly difficult for the jury, and the world, to believe him. How could they trust a man who had manipulated everyone around him, including his own family, to cover up a crime so cold and calculated? The investigation had been methodical, precise. The authorities had followed every lead, examined every piece of technology, and listened to every account. But in the end, it wasn't just the data from Connie's Fitbit that sealed Richard's fate. It was the realization that this had all been a carefully orchestrated plan, a plan that Richard had believed would protect him. But in the end, the one thing he hadn't counted on was the very technology he'd used to his advantage. The killer had planned every detail, except for the tech that tracked every step. The Fitbit, the phone records, the security cameras, they all painted a picture that Richard could no longer escape. And as the final day of the trial loomed, one question remained: how long would it take for the truth to fully unravel, and what would that truth mean for everyone who had trusted him? As the evidence continued to mount, as the walls closed in, Richard's fate seemed all but sealed. And yet, the question lingered: was this really just a tragic accident, a case of a desperate man caught in a web of his own making? Or had something even darker been at play, something far more calculated than anyone had imagined? Story 5. She smiled in his family photos, her arm draped casually around his shoulder, eyes glistening with the warmth of shared memories. To anyone who looked at that picture, they saw a loving granddaughter, the cherished grandchild who would one day inherit the world she had been promised. But beneath that smile, hidden in the corners of her mind, was something far more dangerous, a cold calculation waiting to strike. Brittany J. Dwyer had always been different. From a young age, there were signs, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once you looked closely. An obsession with wealth, with what it could buy, with what it could offer. The lure of a comfortable life, free from worry, free from the pressures that most people faced. But for Brittany, the promise of that life wasn't just a dream, it was an entitlement. She believed she deserved it, and if that meant making her grandfather, the man who had raised her, a mere obstacle in the way of her future, then so be it. Her grandfather had always been kind to her. He had cared for her when no one else would, offering her shelter when she had nowhere to go, love when she had no one to turn to. But that love, that tenderness, would soon be repaid in the most brutal way. The day she planned his murder had started just like any other. He had been at home, in his quiet house, with no idea that the granddaughter he had so faithfully cared for was planning to end his life. The day she murdered him, he had even offered her a glass of milk. A simple, innocent gesture, one that would have been completely normal between a loving grandparent and their granddaughter. He had no idea that this would be the last time he would offer that simple kindness. No idea that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she would strike. She took the glass, as he did the same. They spoke for a moment, and then, without warning, she turned on him. The knife she had hidden in her pocket plunged into his chest with a force that left him gasping for breath, choking on the life that he had tried to give her. But it wasn't over. No, the story wasn't that simple. She left. She walked out of the house, as if nothing had happened. She left the old man to die, abandoned him to the floor in the dim light of his kitchen. But she didn't leave for long. She came back. She came back to make sure he was really gone. To see if he had truly breathed his last breath. That moment sealed his fate. With that return, with that final act of ensuring his death, she cemented her own guilt. In the courtroom, as the trial began, the image of Brittany weeping into her hands became a focal point for everyone watching. Tears streamed down her face, as though she truly regretted her actions, as though the weight of what she had done had finally caught up with her. But was it guilt? Or was it the regret of being caught, of seeing her perfect plan crumble to dust before her eyes? As the case unfolded, it became clear that Brittany had been under the influence of someone else. Someone who had pushed her, manipulated her into believing that this was the only way to get what she deserved. But in the end, it was her decision to follow through with the plan. It was her hand that held the knife, her heart that had turned cold. The court was divided. Some saw a young woman who had been broken by her circumstances, pushed into a corner where her only way out was to commit murder. Others saw a cold-blooded killer, someone willing to do anything to get what she wanted. Was she a victim, a person broken by life's cruelty, or was she just another predator, willing to kill to get ahead? In the weeks that followed the trial, people continued to ask that question: was Brittany J. Dwyer a cold-blooded killer, or was she a broken soul manipulated into committing a heinous crime? As she sat in the courtroom, her head bowed, no one could say for certain. All they knew was that one man had lost his life, and she, the granddaughter who once smiled in family photos, had taken it. And as she wept, there were no answers to the deeper questions, just the image of a woman who would never again escape the shadow of the crime she had committed. The media buzzed with mixed opinions about Brittany's actions. Some saw her as a tragic figure, a young woman so desperate for a better life that she allowed herself to be manipulated into a crime she might have never committed on her own. Others couldn't shake the chilling image of her standing over her grandfather's lifeless body, her actions so calculated, so cold, that it painted a different picture, one of a young woman who had chosen to kill for the promise of wealth and freedom. Her trial continued to unfold, revealing more about the dynamics of her relationship with her accomplice, a man who had clearly influenced her decisions. But as each new detail came to light, it raised even more questions. Did she truly have no choice? Or had she always been a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right opportunity to fulfill her dark desires? As the evidence mounted, it became increasingly clear that Brittany's motives went far beyond just the financial inheritance. There were whispers in the courtroom that she had wanted to break free from the limitations she had felt throughout her life. The obsession with money, the urge to live without boundaries, and the underlying resentment she had carried for years all pointed toward a carefully crafted plan. Perhaps it wasn't just about the money. It was about power, control, and taking what she believed she was owed. Her actions didn't just devastate her grandfather's family, they shattered the illusion of safety and trust within the home. No one could ever look at Brittany the same way again. The woman who had once been the smile in family photos became the killer who took the life of the very man who had raised her. And as she sat in court, her emotions, genuine or not, couldn't erase the fact that she had taken someone's life for her own gain. Brittany's story became a chilling reminder of how the thirst for wealth can twist even the most familiar relationships. How, under the right circumstances, the people closest to you can turn into strangers, and strangers can become accomplices to your darkest desires. But as the trial neared its conclusion, and the jury deliberated on her fate, one question lingered above all others: how could a granddaughter, someone who had been given everything, love, security, family, be capable of such a horrific betrayal? Was it her upbringing, the influences of those around her, or something darker within her that led her to that terrible moment? And when the verdict finally came, it wasn't just a decision on Brittany's guilt. It was a reflection of the complexities of human nature, the line between victim and perpetrator, between love and betrayal, and the ultimate cost of a life taken for greed. The courtroom fell silent as the decision was read. Whether she was sentenced to years behind bars or given a chance at redemption, one thing was certain: her actions would haunt her forever. The family who once saw her as a cherished member would never again view her in the same light. The man who had cared for her was gone, and the inheritance she had once sought was now forever tainted by the blood of betrayal. As Brittany faced her consequences, one final question echoed in the minds of everyone who had followed the case: could she ever truly escape the shadow of the man she had killed for money? And in the end, would the wealth she had so desperately sought ever bring her peace, or would it only leave her with the haunting memory of the grandfather she had once loved, and the life she had destroyed in pursuit of her own desires? The chilling truth lingered long after the trial had ended, as the dark shadow of her crime would follow her wherever she went. Story 6. It was a warm December day in 2003 when Daniel Morcombe stepped out of his home to wait for the bus. He was just 13 years old, carrying the promise of a normal day ahead, a ride to the shopping mall, perhaps, a chance to spend time with friends. But the bus never arrived. And Daniel never came home. His family, his community, and the entire country were left with an unthinkable void. It wasn't just the sudden disappearance of a child, it was the disappearance of a piece of innocence, a crack in the safety of suburban life. The world around Daniel's family, once a comfortable routine, turned into a world of dread and uncertainty. From the moment he vanished, the search began. Search parties combed the thick bushland around the Morcombe family's home. Flyers bearing Daniel's face filled every street corner, every community board. His parents, Bruce and Denise, refused to give up, holding on to hope that their son would come back. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, but the search continued. As the years passed, their grief was swallowed by the uncertainty that lingered, never allowing them a moment of peace. The entire nation watched. The case was no longer just a local tragedy, it was a national nightmare. People all across Australia rallied, hoping for any clue that could lead them to Daniel. But with every passing year, the chances of finding him grew slimmer. And then, 8 years later, the unthinkable happened. In 2011, Daniel's disappearance took a shocking turn when a man named Brett Peter Cowan came forward with a confession. Cowan, whose name had never surfaced in the case before, suddenly became the center of the investigation. The confession was chilling, yet oddly casual. He claimed to have abducted, murdered, and disposed of Daniel's body all those years ago. But what made his confession even more disturbing was that it was only brought to light after he had been arrested for a completely unrelated crime. The details of his confession were enough to make even the most hardened detectives recoil in horror. He described, in painstaking detail, the abduction of Daniel, the lies, the manipulation, and the twisted logic behind his actions. Cowan, a man whose name was now etched into the tragic story of Daniel's disappearance, had been living in plain sight all along, his life seemingly untouched by the gravity of the crime he had committed. But for Daniel's family, the nightmare didn't end with Cowan's confession. The trial that followed was a battle for justice, not just for Daniel, but for every parent who had ever feared the loss of their child. As the details of the crime were laid bare in court, the pain was almost unbearable. But for Daniel's parents, this was not just a fight for justice, it was a fight to reclaim their son's memory, to ensure that his life was not reduced to the horror of his final moments. Finally, in 2014, after years of legal battles, Cowan was convicted of Daniel's murder. His confession, though chilling, had led to the discovery of Daniel's remains, buried in a remote area far from where he had last been seen. It was a painful but crucial piece of closure for Daniel's family, who had spent nearly a decade hoping against hope for any resolution. In the years following Daniel's death, his parents turned their grief into something powerful. They founded the Daniel Morcombe Foundation, a mission to raise awareness about child safety and to ensure that no other family would endure the heartbreak they had. Their fight for justice and the memory of their son became a beacon of hope for countless others. But as the case closed, questions lingered. Was justice truly served? Did the legal system fail to act swiftly enough, allowing a monster to roam free for so many years? Was there more to Cowan's confession than met the eye? And, in the end, what was the cost of waiting so long for the truth? As Bruce and Denise Morcombe look back on the journey they've endured, they often reflect on the most painful question of all: would they have ever found their son if the pieces of this case had not fallen into place? Would the country have rallied in the same way if it wasn't for the haunting image of Daniel's smiling face on every flyer, every news report? And above all, what will happen when justice is finally done? Will it be enough to heal the broken hearts of a family that was torn apart by the loss of their precious boy? For Daniel, the search had ended, but for his parents, the search for peace was only just beginning. And as they continue to fight for child safety, they hold on to the memory of their son, knowing that his story, though tragic, will live on in the hearts of those who loved him. As the years passed, Daniel Morcombe's legacy continued to shape Australia's approach to child safety. His parents, Bruce and Denise, who had endured unimaginable loss, channeled their grief into a powerful mission, ensuring that the pain they suffered would serve as a beacon for others. The Daniel Morcombe Foundation became a national movement, dedicated to educating children and parents alike about personal safety. Through school programs, awareness campaigns, and partnerships with law enforcement, the foundation worked tirelessly to ensure that no other child would vanish without a trace. Yet, the emotional toll remained. While the trial brought some closure, the trauma of Daniel's abduction was never fully erased. Bruce and Denise spoke openly about the long-lasting impact of their son's disappearance, not only on their lives but on the lives of the countless others affected by child abduction. Their voice became one of advocacy, saying, "We may never have the answers to all our questions, but we will keep fighting to make sure our son's memory lives on, in every lesson learned, and every child protected." The case raised many questions about justice and the legal system. While Brett Cowan's conviction brought a degree of closure, it was not without controversy. The delay in finding Daniel's body, the years of uncertainty, and the fact that Cowan had lived for years in the shadows of the crime without raising suspicion sparked heated debates. Could law enforcement have moved more swiftly? Could there have been more done to stop him from committing other crimes? The legal battle exposed the flaws in the system, where a child's life could be taken, and the truth could remain hidden for so long. In 2014, Cowan was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but it felt like little more than a formality in the face of the enormous grief that would never be reversed. The pain of losing Daniel was a wound that never truly healed for his family. The weight of the years they spent searching for answers, living through a national tragedy, and dealing with the psychological toll of it all, seemed almost too much for any parent to bear. But despite the heartbreak, there was one thing that continued to shine through: Daniel's family had not given up. They had fought for every inch of justice, and they had made sure that their son's legacy would endure long after the trial had concluded. Daniel may have been taken too soon, but the love his family carried for him, the love of a mother and father who refused to let their son's memory fade, was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. It took too long to find justice, but the fight was worth it, not just for Daniel, but for every child who now had the benefit of the lessons learned through this tragedy. The Morcombe family's journey may have been filled with unimaginable pain, but it also ended with the unwavering belief that no child should ever have to face what Daniel did. In the end, justice wasn't just about the conviction of Brett Cowan. It was about the lasting impact Daniel's story had on a country, on a generation, and on a movement for children's safety that will continue long after the headlines fade. As Bruce and Denise often say, we won't stop fighting for the children of tomorrow, because Daniel is with us every step of the way. Story 7. It began with something that seemed harmless, a hallway conversation, a few kind words, the familiar face of a man paid to protect. Tanya Catch was just 14. She walked the same school corridors each day, a quiet student trying to find her place. He was the security guard. Older. Friendly. His name was Thomas Hose. And he was always around. At first, he asked how her day was. Then he gave her small gifts. Compliments. Little signs of attention that made her feel seen. For a girl navigating the confusion of adolescence, it felt like connection. He told her she was special. That he understood her in ways no one else did. And slowly, bit by bit, he pulled her away from her world, and into his. It didn't happen all at once. That's what makes it so chilling. Tanya didn't vanish overnight. She was groomed, quietly, gradually. He isolated her from friends. Made her believe her parents didn't care. That the only person who loved her, really loved her, was him. When she ran away from home in February 1996, she believed she was running toward freedom. In truth, she was stepping into a prison. She didn't leave the house again for years. Tanya was hidden inside Hose's parents' home in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. For the first 4 years, she wasn't allowed outside her small upstairs room. Her meals were brought to her. The windows were covered. There was no sunlight, no fresh air. Just the muffled sounds of life happening beyond the walls. When visitors came to the house, she was hidden behind a false wall, tucked inside a tiny closet space, where she would crouch in silence, waiting for the voices to fade. Her name was erased. Her identity stripped. Hose told his parents she was his girlfriend named Nikki. She was 24, he claimed. No one questioned it. Tanya wasn't just locked away physically, she was emotionally and mentally trapped. Every aspect of her life was controlled. She was allowed downstairs only under supervision. She couldn't speak to anyone. Her entire existence was built around secrecy and fear. She later said, "At first, I thought it was love. Then I realized I was a prisoner." The years slipped by. Birthdays passed. News cycles changed. The world moved on. But Tanya remained inside that house. Her name became just another cold case file. Her family mourned her as gone, lost to the streets, or worse. But she was still there. Living behind the closet door of a house just blocks from where she had vanished. Then something shifted. 10 years later, in 2006, Tanya convinced Hose to let her venture outside, as Nikki, still pretending. He began allowing her small freedoms. She found work at a local grocery store. She smiled at customers. No one knew her real name. But the cracks had begun to form. She started speaking with a coworker. Slowly, she began to remember who she had been. That she once had a life. That she was someone more than just the girl behind the door. One day, she took a risk. She confided in a store manager, told him her real name. Her story. What had happened. And just like that, after a decade in darkness, Tanya Catch was free. Police arrested Thomas Hose shortly after. He was charged with multiple counts, including statutory sexual assault and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. He ultimately pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. He served fewer than 10. But Tanya? Her sentence lasted far longer. She had to rebuild her identity. Relearn what it meant to trust. To exist in a world that had kept turning while she had been forgotten. The trauma didn't end when the door opened. Still, she chose to speak out. Tanya turned her pain into purpose. She wrote a book, Memoir of a Milk Carton Kid, detailing the horror of her captivity and the long journey back to herself. She began advocating for other victims of abuse, speaking publicly about grooming and psychological manipulation. She gave voice to the ones who couldn't speak, who were still hidden in silence. And yet, the scars never truly faded. Some days were better than others. Some nights, she could sleep without fear. Other nights, the past returned, heavy and suffocating. Healing, she learned, is not a straight path. It's a winding road of progress and relapse. Of courage and vulnerability, her story became a warning, and a symbol. A warning that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who betray us deepest. And a symbol of what it means to survive. Not just to escape, but to reclaim a stolen life. Tanya Catch got out. But the closet she lived in stayed with her. Even after she escaped, Tanya Catch's life was far from normal. Her name was splashed across headlines. Reporters called her the girl in the closet. But that title didn't begin to capture the weight of what she had endured. She had missed a decade of growing up. 10 years without a birthday party, a friend, a real conversation. She hadn't seen the internet evolve. She had never owned a cell phone. She stepped out into a world that had changed entirely while she had been locked behind a false wall. And yet, she pressed forward. The trial came quickly. In 2007, Thomas Hose pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Many felt the sentence was far too short. But legally, prosecutors faced challenges. Tanya had been over the age of consent by the time she escaped, and much of the abuse happened in secrecy, leaving little physical evidence. Hose was released in 2012, just 6 years after Tanya's rescue. That fact haunted her. While he walked free, she was still navigating the long road of trauma recovery. She struggled with PTSD, anxiety, and an overwhelming sense of lost time. In interviews, she admitted she often questioned who she might have become if Hose had never entered her life. What she might have done. Who she might have been. But Tanya refused to disappear again. She began telling her story in schools, at conferences, and on national television. She partnered with advocacy groups to raise awareness about grooming, coercion, and long-term captivity. Her goal wasn't just to be heard, it was to protect other children from ever experiencing what she had. Her memoir became a lifeline for survivors. It wasn't a tale of overnight healing or sudden clarity, it was raw, real, and deeply human. Tanya didn't paint herself as a hero. She described confusion, misplaced loyalty, shame. And, eventually, the strength to reclaim her voice. Over time, she rebuilt relationships with her family. Her father, who had never stopped looking for her, became a quiet presence of support. Still, the wounds ran deep. Reconnecting meant confronting all the birthdays, holidays, and memories they had missed. Some things, Tanya said, could never be fully repaired, but they could be honored. Today, Tanya lives a quiet life out of the public eye. But the echoes of her past remain. She said that she no longer lets her trauma define her, but she acknowledges it will always be part of her story. Part of who she is. She was a girl hidden behind a door for 10 years. But she stepped back into the world with courage. And she stayed. They looked like neighbors. Teachers. Friends. They walked dogs, paid taxes, smiled in family photos. But hidden in their homes, or buried in their pasts, were secrets few could ever imagine. A father who dined upstairs while his daughter wept in a cell below. A man who charmed victims over tea, then reduced them to liquid in an acid-filled drum. A girl, missing for a decade, was never more than a few feet away, trapped behind drywall. These weren't just headlines. They were lives. And tonight, as the rain quietly fell and the world slowed down around you, you sat with their stories. You listened, not just with curiosity, but with something deeper. A sense that truth matters. That silence can be dangerous. That looking away isn't an option. If you've made it this far, you're not just a listener. You're part of something more, someone who doesn't flinch from the uncomfortable, someone who understands that knowing the truth is how we protect each other. So, which story stayed with you? Which moment made your breath catch? Was it the father's lie? The girl in the closet? The bones in the backyard? Tell me in the comments, I read every one. And if you want to keep going, if the rain outside hasn't lulled you to sleep just yet, click here for the next story. It only gets deeper from here. Subscribe. Like. Share with someone who needs to hear what's really out there. And above all, stay safe. Stay curious.